I realized something was off the moment I drove into my driveway and saw a mysterious SUV parked in my garage like it owned the place. It wasn't my sister's car, it wasn't my neighbor's, and it definitely wasn't mine. The worst part? The garage door was wide open, as if the universe was displaying the absurdity of the situation in broad daylight. I had been gone for barely 8 hours, and in that short time, someone had claimed my property like a lion marking its territory. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake, some delivery guy using my space to turn around, maybe a confused Uber driver. But when I stepped out of my car and got a closer look, my instincts told me this was something else entirely. The car was parked perfectly inside, as if the driver had taken their sweet time aligning it just right. The door was locked, and to make things even stranger, there was a half-empty iced coffee on the hood, the moisture still fresh, meaning someone had been here recently. I strode up to my front door, checked to ensure nothing else had been tampered with, and went straight to the neighbors. That's when I met her, Karen. She appeared before I even knocked, stepping out of her house with the kind of boldness that only comes with a lifetime of getting away with nonsense. Short bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and an expression that screamed, "I dare you to challenge me." "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Do you know whose car that is in my garage?" She didn't even pause. "Yeah, it's mine." Silence. I blinked. She sipped her drink. "I'm sorry, what?" "I parked there," she repeated, as if that somehow clarified everything. I needed the space. I laughed, waiting for her to tell me she was joking, but she just stared at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "So you just parked in my garage?" I asked, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. She scoffed. "It was empty. What's the big deal? You weren't even using it." Oh, this was going to be a problem. I took a deep breath, gripping the bridge of my nose to stop myself from losing it. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just park in my garage because you feel like it." She rolled her eyes. "Well, I was in a rush, and your driveway was too steep for my SUV. You have so much room, and I figured since you weren't home, what's the problem?" The absolute boldness almost made me laugh, almost. "The problem is that it's against the law," I said, my patience fading. "You're trespassing. Move your car." She crossed her arms. "I will, but I have errands to run, so I'll get to it later." "Later," I repeated, now actually laughing in shock. "No, you'll move it now." Karen let out an over-the-top sigh, like I was some demanding landlord asking for rent on time. "I can't. I'm going out with my friends. Just be a good neighbor and let's stay." And with that, she turned and walked back into her house, closing the door in my face. I stood there, jaw tight, trying to process what had just happened. I had met my fair share of entitled people, but Karen? Karen was operating on a completely different level. I could have called the police. I could have had her car towed. But something about her smug little grin as she brushed me off ignited a much pettier fire inside me. Fine. She wanted to park in my garage so badly? She could stay in my garage. Without hesitation, I walked back to my house, grabbed the garage door remote, and manually locked it from the inside. Then I secured the side door with the deadbolt, checked everything twice, and made sure there was no way in or out. And then I packed my bags and left for a week. Now here's where things got really interesting. What I didn't know at the time was that Karen had gone into the garage before I locked it. She must have returned to grab something from her car, assuming she could come and go as she pleased. But with the door secured and no way to open it from the inside without the remote, she was trapped. By the time I was halfway to my vacation destination, sipping a drink in the sun, Karen was stuck in my garage with nothing but her purse and the contents of her car to keep her company. Back home, the neighborhood was starting to notice her absence. Her husband, Greg, seemed mildly worried but mostly unconcerned. I later found out that he had assumed she went on a shopping trip or a girl's getaway. But Susan, her best friend and fellow drama queen, started asking questions. Meanwhile, inside the garage, Karen was realizing just how limited her choices were. She had no phone signal, no food except for some old protein bars I had forgotten about, and worst of all, no working restroom. She pounded on the walls, yelled for help, and even tried to pick the lock with a hairpin, but the garage door remained firmly shut. By day 3, she was desperate. She tried everything banging on the walls at night, honking the horn, even attempting to squeeze through the doggy door in a move so ridiculous that I wish I had security footage of it. Meanwhile, I was completely unaware, enjoying my trip with zero interruptions until I received a message from an unknown number. "Help me, you monster." I stared at the screen, confused. Then another message popped up. "You locked me in, you psychopath. Let me out." And that's when I realized what had happened. Karen hadn't just parked in my garage, she had parked herself in my garage. And now she wanted out. But I wasn't in any hurry to fix her problem. After all, she had told me to be a good neighbor and let her park there, hadn't she? I smirked, put my phone away, and ordered another drink. Karen could wait. By the second day, Karen had gone through every possible emotion: anger, denial, bargaining, and full-blown desperation. She had screamed, kicked the walls, honked the car horn so many times that the battery was nearly dead, and even banged on the garage door with a tire iron she found in the trunk. But nothing worked. The garage door was locked tight, and no one had come to her rescue. It was starting to sink in that she might actually be stuck here for a while. At first, she had convinced herself that someone would hear her. After all, she was Karen, and Karen always got her way. Surely a neighbor would notice her absence. Maybe Greg would realize something was wrong and come looking for her. But as the hours passed, reality set in. Greg wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, and honestly, he was probably enjoying the silence. The neighbors? They didn't like her enough to be concerned. The only person who could fix this was Jake, and he was sipping margaritas somewhere far away, completely unaware, or worse, fully aware of her situation. She had to survive. The first challenge was food and water. A quick search through her purse revealed some breath mints, a crumpled granola bar wrapper that had nothing but crumbs, and a half-full bottle of overpriced alkaline water. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She scoured the car next, rummaging through the glove compartment and center console, like a raccoon digging through trash. Jackpot! A pack of stale crackers, a melted chocolate bar, and an old energy drink. It wasn't exactly a gourmet meal, but it was better than nothing. The bathroom situation was a different nightmare, entirely. After holding in as long as she could, she finally gave up and had to resort to an empty Starbucks cup in the back seat. It was humiliating, disgusting, and something she would never speak of again. She swore that the moment she got out of here, she would sue Jake into oblivion. She would make sure he regretted ever messing with her. By the third day, she was starting to lose it. The walls of the garage felt like they were closing in. The air smelled like a mix of car exhaust and desperation, and she had spent too much time arguing with herself. She tried sleeping, but the car seats were uncomfortable, and the sound of absolute silence was unnerving. Every creak, every distant dog bark, every car passing by outside made her heart race. She would have given anything for her phone, but the signal was non-existent in the garage, and her battery had died anyway. At one point, she got the brilliant idea to escape through the doggy door on the side entrance. It was a small flap meant for a golden retriever, not a fully grown woman, but she was desperate enough to try. She got on her stomach, wiggled forward, and managed to squeeze her head through. The rest of her, however, was not cooperating. Her shoulders were too broad, her hips refused to budge, and she was now stuck halfway in and halfway out, like a pathetic cartoon character. It took her 20 minutes of struggling, screaming, and pure humiliation before she finally managed to pull herself back inside. She was reaching her breaking point. Meanwhile, back in the real world, things were beginning to get suspicious. Karen's best friend, Susan, had started asking around. Greg, who had enjoyed a few peaceful days of quiet, was beginning to notice that his wife hadn't texted him in a while. He had assumed she was out shopping or at a spa day, but when Susan called him for the fourth time, suggesting something might actually be wrong, even he had to admit it was a little odd. Greg eventually wandered over to Jake's house, knocking on the door. When there was no answer, he peeked around the property, checking to see if Karen's car was still parked somewhere. The garage was locked tight, and without any obvious sign of his wife, Greg shrugged and went home. If she was in trouble, she would have found a way to make sure everyone knew about it. Back in the garage, Karen was now at the stage of insanity where she started talking to objects. The iced coffee cup from earlier had become Wilson, her only companion. She had full conversations with it, blaming Jake for her situation, blaming Greg for not realizing she was missing, and blaming the universe for allowing this to happen to someone as important as her. Wilson, of course, had no response, which only made her angrier. Then, in a moment of desperation, she remembered something. The garage had one tiny window near the ceiling. It wasn't big enough to climb through, but maybe, just maybe, she could get someone's attention. Stacking whatever she could find, she climbed onto the hood of her car, then onto the roof, and finally reached the window. She could see the street outside. Freedom was so close, yet so far. She screamed for help, waving her arms like a madwoman, but no one was around. The only person who did walk by was Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who always wore noise-canceling headphones when he went on his daily walk. He didn't even glance in her direction. Her last hope was honking the horn again, but after draining the car battery earlier, that was no longer an option. She was stuck, defeated, trapped in a garage that, until recently, she had thought of as her personal parking space. And then, just when she had finally accepted her fate, she heard her phone vibrating in the cup holder. Scrambling back down, she lunged for it, praying that she had just enough battery left. The screen was dark dead. She cursed, shaking it, willing it to turn back on, but it was useless. She was still trapped, still helpless. Then, as if to add insult to injury, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone pulling into the driveway. Her heart leapt. Finally, someone had come to save her. But the second she saw who it was, her relief turned into pure rage. It was Jake. The garage door started to open, flooding the space with fresh air and sunlight. And as soon as it was halfway up, Karen exploded out like a bat out of hell, wild-eyed, furious, and ready to unleash every ounce of pent-up frustration. Jake, however, just stood there, sipping a drink like he hadn't just left her to rot for a week. Well, he said, smirking, looks like someone had an eventful time. Karen saw red. She was going to destroy him. Karen had never felt this level of rage in her life. The second she stumbled out of the garage, wild-eyed and disheveled, she barely took a breath before launching into a full-blown screaming fit. Jake, on the other hand, stood there with the most infuriatingly relaxed posture, sipping his iced coffee as if he had just come back from a casual grocery run, rather than returning to a hostage he had unintentionally trapped in his garage for a week. "You absolute psychopath," Karen screeched, her voice hoarse from days of shouting inside the enclosed space. "You locked me in there. You left me to rot. Do you have any idea what I've been through?" Jake raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I mean, I assumed you'd move your car when I told you to. Guess that didn't happen." Karen's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was dirty, exhausted, dehydrated, and beyond humiliated. The smell of stale energy drinks and sweat clung to her. Her once perfectly straightened, bob was now frizzed beyond recognition. She had spent days planning her payback, imagining about every possible way to make Jake feel pain for what he had caused. And then, to make things even worse, her husband, Greg, finally decided to show up. He drove into the driveway, stepping out of the vehicle with a puzzled look. "Hey babe, where have you been? Susan said she hasn't heard from you in days." Karen spun around, barely holding herself together. "Greg, this madman trapped me in his garage for a week." Greg glanced at Jake, then at the security footage in his hand, then back at Karen. "Wait, so you were in his garage? Why? I left my car there for a while, and then he shut it. He did this to me." Greg rubbed the back of his head. "So, why did you leave your car at his garage?" Karen's mouth opened, then shut. "That's not the point, Greg." Jake nodded at Greg with a friendly look. "Your wife entered my property, refused to move her vehicle, and then got herself stuck in my garage when I went on a trip. I've got it all on video, including the moment where she messaged me to free her." Greg exhaled deeply. "Karen, did you actually do that?" Karen was ready to explode. This was embarrassing. She had spent days suffering, expecting everyone to be on her side the moment she escaped, and now her own husband was doubting her. Jake clapped his hands. All right, well, I'm not going to press charges, but I will be installing a new security system to make sure this never happens again. Karen scoffed. Like I would ever leave my car in your garage again. You crazy man. Jake grinned. Great, then we're on the same page. Karen fumed, feeling completely defeated. This wasn't over. She would figure out a way to get back at him. She had to. But then, as if the universe wanted to deliver one final strike, her phone buzzed with a notification of fine, a huge one from the Homeowners Association. The message was clear: unauthorized use of another resident's property, several complaints from neighbors, and a decision from the HOA to remove her community privileges for a whole year. No pool access, no clubhouse bookings, nothing. Jake gave her a small wave. See you around, Karen. Karen wanted to yell. She wanted to fight, but there was nothing left to do. With no other option, she stormed back to Greg's car, embarrassed beyond belief. Greg, meanwhile, just sighed. So, should I even ask? Drive, Karen snapped, folding her arms. And with that, Greg put the car in reverse and drove them away. Jake watched them leave, then turned back to his garage, shaking his head in amusement. He had won, and the best part? Karen had done it to herself.